All right, everybody. Ready to dive into some serious Unity mobile game optimization?
Let's do it.
We're talking about squeezing every last drop of performance out of your game. And lucky for us, we've got this awesome guide, Unity Optimize Your Mobile Game Performance.pdf, to show us the way.
This guide is like the ultimate cheat sheet, jam-packed with tips and tricks from the pros.
And we're not just going to scratch the surface here. We're going deep, uncovering the why behind the what.
Exactly. Because when you understand the reasoning behind these techniques, that's when the real magic happens.
Now, I know it's tempting to jump right into the fun stuff, the fancy graphics, the cool game mechanics, all that. But this guide, it stresses something super important right off the bat: profiling.
And not just as a last-minute check, like, oh, shoot, my game is laggy, better do some profiling.
Right. It's got to be baked into your process from the get-go.
Think of it like analyzing your game's DNA. You're looking for those hidden bottlenecks, those sneaky performance killers that might not be obvious at first glance.
That's like detective work, right? You're searching for clues to figure out what's slowing your game down.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting. The guide, it recommends profiling on low-end devices, too.
Not just our fancy developer phones with all the latest specs.
Nope, not just those. We got to see how our game performs on the devices that most people are actually using.
Makes sense. I'll admit, I'm guilty of testing mostly on my high-end phone. But that's not exactly realistic, is it?
It's a trap we all fall into. We get so used to our games running smoothly on our own devices, but we got to remember that not everyone has the latest and greatest tech.
Right. We want our games to reach as many players as possible.
Absolutely. The guide also talks about using something called short bursts to simulate real-world heat.
Short bursts? Like, what does that even mean?
Well, think about it. When you're playing a game on your phone, does your phone stay ice cold the whole time?
Definitely not. It can get pretty warm, especially if I'm playing for a while.
Exactly. And that heat, it can actually impact performance. So these short bursts, it's a way to stress test our game, see how it handles those real-world conditions.
Wow, I never even thought about that. So we're profiling like pros, digging into those performance reports, and bam, we hit a massive spike.
Oh no, what is it?
It's GC, that dreaded garbage collection rearing its ugly head. I thought Unity handled memory management for us.
It does to a certain extent, but even without diving into manual memory management, we still got to be mindful of how Unity's GC operates, especially in a mobile environment.
So it's not a free pass then?
Not quite. This guide dives into some common culprits that can trigger those nasty GC spikes.
Oh, really? Like, what? Spill the tea. What are these sneaky performance killers?
Well, for starters, strings.
Strings, as in like text.
Yep. All those text manipulations, like when you're updating UI elements, displaying in-game dialogue.
Oh, I gotta have that juicy dialogue.
Exactly. But all that string manipulation, it can put a strain on resources, especially on mobile devices where memory is limited.
So even though those operations seem small, they can add up over time.
Think of it like those tiny drips from a leaky faucet. Individually, no big deal, right?
But over time, those drips, they can cause some serious damage.
Exactly. It's the same idea with these seemingly insignificant performance hits. They can accumulate and eventually lead to lag, stutters, all sorts of problems that can kill the player experience.
So it sounds like even those small oversights in memory management, they can really come back to bite you on mobile.
Right.
Are there ways to, mitigate those GC spikes without having to go full-on manual memory management?
Oh, absolutely. This guide, it's all about working smarter, not harder, right? One handy trick they mention is timing your GC calls strategically.
Timing our GC calls. So instead of just letting garbage collection happen whenever it feels like it, we can kind of nudge it along at specific times.
Exactly. You got it. And for those times when you need even more control, there's always the incremental garbage collector. Like, instead of having one big cleanup crew come in and interrupt the whole game, you've got a smaller team working continuously in the background.
So it's less disruptive to the player's experience. Okay, so we're profiling, we're tackling those GC gremlins. What about the code itself? Any ninja coding techniques in this guide that can help us write more performant code from the get-go?
Yeah, tons of them. And they drop a real gem early on. Empty Unity events, they're not free.
Wait, seriously? Just having those empty update methods lying around, even if they're not doing anything, that can actually slow things down.
You got it. It's tempting to just leave them there, just in case. But even those empty functions, they have a cost, however small.
It's like those energy vampires. Those devices that still drain power even when they're turned off.
The perfect analogy. Now, imagine you're like frantically searching for your keys, right? Rummaging through your bag, your pockets, under the couch cushions. It's the worst.
The worst.
Caching is like putting those keys in a designated spot every single time you walk in the door.
So when you need them, bam, they're right there. The guide, it uses the get component example to illustrate this, right?
Precisely. Instead of constantly searching for that component, you cache it and then boom, those subsequent accesses, they're lightning fast. The guide also dives into object pooling, which is a real game changer, especially for mobile games where you might have tons of objects being created and destroyed all the time.
Right, like imagine a bullet hell shooter with hundreds of projectiles on screen at once. If you had to instantiate and destroy each one individually, it would bring the game to its knees.
Exactly. Object pooling is like having a pre-made pool of those bullets just ready to go. Instead of creating a brand new bullet each time, you grab one from the pool, use it, and then when you're done with it, back into the pool it goes.
So it's more efficient, plus it helps reduce those GC spikes we were talking about.
Win-win.
Okay, so we're writing cleaner code, more efficient code. But what about the art? Stunning graphics can make a huge difference in a mobile game, but obviously we don't want them to come at the cost of performance.
Absolutely. It's a delicate balance. This guide, it stresses the importance of not just blindly relying on those default import settings for your assets.
Oh yeah, I'm totally guilty of that. Just hitting import and hoping for the best.
It's easy to do, but those default settings, they can be way overkill for mobile. You end up with these bloated build sizes, slower performance, the whole 9 yards. In fact, the guide gives this crazy example. They say that textures can use up to 8 times the memory if you don't optimize them properly.
8 times. Yikes. Talk about a performance killer.
Yeah.
So what's the solution? Are there specific texture compression formats we should be using?
The guide highlights ASTC as the gold standard for most modern devices. But like with everything in optimization, it's not one size fits all. You got to know your target audience. For older iPhones or Android devices, you might need to fall back on PVRTC or ETC2.
Right, right. Choose the right tool for the job. And I'm guessing the same principle applies to mesh optimization, right? We don't always need ultra-high poly models, especially if they're just going to be tiny on a small screen.
Exactly. The guide encourages us to be mindful of our polygon counts, especially for things like background elements or objects that are far away from the player. Sometimes, less is more, especially when it comes to those precious draw calls.
Right, because each draw call is basically telling the GPU, hey, render this thing. And if you've got too many draw calls going on at once,
It's like trying to have a conversation with 100 people talking at the same time.
complete chaos. So how do we make sure those graphics are playing nice with the GPU without sacrificing the visual fidelity we're after?
Well, this guide has a whole section dedicated to what they call GPU wizardry, which sounds pretty awesome.
Sign me up.
It breaks down those universal render pipeline, URP options, forward, and deferred in a way that's actually understandable. Because let's be real, that stuff can get pretty technical.
No kidding. Even if I understand what those rendering paths are, how do I know which one is right for my game? Especially if I want to have, like, complex lighting effects and stuff.
Well, that's where this guide shines, right? It explains the trade-offs between those rendering paths, but it also emphasizes that, yes, you can achieve incredible visual fidelity on mobile, even with complex lighting. It just takes some strategic thinking.
So it's all about finding those clever workarounds.
Exactly. Like, for example, the guide talks about using light mapping for static elements in your scene.
Light mapping.
It's this technique where you essentially bake the lighting information into a texture.
Ah, so instead of calculating the lighting in real time, it's pre-calculated.
Exactly. It significantly reduces the amount of work the GPU has to do at runtime. And then, for dynamic objects that are moving around your scene, the guide recommends using light probes. These little guys, they sample the lighting information at various points and then interpolate the values, which gives you realistic-looking lighting without the performance hit of doing those calculations in real time.
So we're basically tricking the eye into thinking we have this super complex lighting setup, when in reality, we're being really strategic about how we're using those resources.
Precisely. And here's another aha moment from the guide: draw call batching.
Okay, I've heard of that term before, but I'm not going to lie, it still sounds a bit like magic to me.
Okay, think of it this way. You're washing dishes. Instead of washing each individual fork, spoon, and plate separately, you group similar items together to wash them all at once. You're essentially batching those dishes, right?
Yeah.
Which saves you time and water.
Okay, that analogy actually makes a lot of sense. So instead of the GPU having to switch between different materials for every single object, we group similar objects together to reduce those switches and improve performance.
You got it. And remember how we talked about profiling on low-end devices?
Yeah.
All these GPU optimization techniques we've been talking about, they become even more crucial on those devices.
It's like we're giving those older phones a fighting chance to run our game smoothly.
Mm.
And ultimately, that means more people get to enjoy our game the way it was meant to be played.
Exactly.
Okay, we've covered a ton of ground here, from profiling like detectives to squeezing every last drop of performance out of the GPU. But what about the unsung hero of mobile games? The UI. We all know how frustrating a laggy UI can be, especially on mobile where responsiveness is everything.
You're right, it's easy to get caught up in making our game worlds look amazing and forget that the UI is the player's main point of interaction.
Exactly. So what does this guide recommend for keeping menus, buttons, and all those UI elements, snappy and responsive?
Well, one of the key takeaways is to think of your UI like a bento box.
Ooh, I love bento boxes.
Right, each element has its own designated compartment, everything's neat and organized.
So instead of having one massive canvas for our entire UI,
We divide and conquer. Keep static elements like background images or logos separate from those that need to update frequently, like health bars or score counters.
so we're minimizing unnecessary redraws.
Exactly. It's like repainting your entire house just to change the color of one wall. Way overkill.
And speaking of overkill, the guide also reminds us about something so simple but so important: hiding invisible UI elements.
Out of sight, out of mind. Right. Just because the player can't see it doesn't mean the game isn't still wasting precious resources on it.
Right, like turning off the lights when you leave a room. Saves energy, keeps things running smoothly.
Exactly. Same principle applies to disabling raycast targets where they're not needed.
So we're reducing the number of UI elements the game has to constantly check for interactions.
You got it. Now, this might seem obvious, but the guide stresses testing our UI on different screen resolutions and aspect ratios.
Oh, for sure. With so many different mobile devices out there, we can't assume our UI is going to look perfect on everything.
Exactly. A wonky UI can be super frustrating for players, especially if they can't even press the right buttons.
Totally. So any other UI optimization gems in this guide?
Well, here's a neat trick for those moments when the UI takes center stage, like during a pause menu or a loading screen.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Temporarily disable anything in the game world that's not visible behind the UI.
I see. If the pause menu is covering the entire screen, we don't need to waste resources rendering all those 3D models and animations in the background.
Precisely. It's like giving your game a little breather, letting it focus all its power on delivering a smooth UI experience.
I love it. This deep dive has been incredible. I feel like I've learned so much.
Me too. This guide is seriously packed with useful stuff.
It really is.
Yeah.
And you know what? Even implementing just a few of these tips can make a real difference in our games.
Absolutely. Every little bit helps when it comes to optimization, right?
100%. Well, that about wraps it up for this deep dive. Huge thanks to our expert for sharing their wisdom.
My pleasure. Always happy to talk shop.
And to everyone listening, we hope you learned a ton of optimization secrets today. Now go forth and make those mobile games shine.